Wherever you're listening in the world, it's a pleasure to welcome you to IsraelCast, the podcast powered by Jewish National Fund USA, your voice in Israel. I'm Steven Shalowitz. First, reminding you that for over 120 years, Jewish National Fund USA has been the premier philanthropic movement for the land and people of Israel. While best known for planting trees in Israel, JNF USA contributes to Israeli life in so many ways, including community development in the Negev and the Galilee, preservation of heritage sites, supporting people with disabilities, and connecting high school and college students to Israel. To learn more and to see how you can contribute, do visit jnf.org. Once again, jnf.org. And in just a short while, I'll be sharing with you info and dates for the upcoming Jewish National Fund USA Conference 2023. So get your calendars out for that. But first, it is an absolute pleasure to welcome Ben M. Freeman back to IsraelCast. This time, Ben returns to the program to talk about his latest book, and I'm sure not his last. It's called Reclaiming Our Story, The Pursuit of Jewish Pride. You can pick up a copy wherever you like to buy your books. And of course, you may remember Ben from his last visit when we talked about his book, Jewish Pride, Rebuilding a People. Ben, it's always a pleasure to speak with you. Welcome back to IsraelCast.
Thank you for having me. I'm so thrilled to be here with you again.
And we should share with our listeners that this time around, you're zooming in from London town. Last time we spoke to you, you were living in Hong Kong.
Yes, very international. So I left Hong Kong about a year ago. So I've been in London, back in old Blighty, as they say, for about a year.
Where are we going to speak to you next?
Yeah, who knows? For the third book, it'll be somewhere else entirely, I'm sure.
Maybe it'll be in Israel. Maybe you'll be in who knows where. Maybe you'll be even here in New York City, and we can do this face to face. Well, one of these days we will meet indeed across a table and be able to shake hands. But this time around, we have to just sort of settle for Zoom as we do with many of our guests here on IsraelCast. But listen, I have to congratulate you on this book. Once again, Reclaiming Our Story, The Pursuit of Jewish Pride. First of all, I want you to talk about just sort of the origins of the book and how did it come about, Ben?
So this book is a follow-up to my first book, Jewish Pride, Rebuilding a People. And I hadn't intended to write any more books. You know, I wanted to write the first book. I wanted to write Jewish Pride because I wanted to kickstart the modern Jewish Pride movement. And in that book, I devote a chapter to internalized anti-Jewishness, or anti-Semitism, as I referred to it as then. And it was a short chapter, and it didn't go into it in as much detail as obviously this book does. But it was something that everyone wanted to talk about in the hundreds of Zooms that I did to promote that book. And I would get messages on Instagram from people telling me that Jewish Pride, the book, changed their lives. And people often reference that specific chapter. So it really got me thinking, okay, there's a bigger story here. And maybe it's not just a phenomenon which affects a specific type of Jew. Maybe it's something which affects all of us, and I really wanted to explore it. So it's kind of an organic thing. You know, as I said, I never set out to write a trilogy. There will be a third book in the Jewish Pride trilogy, but it's kind of happened just because there seemed to be interest and there was more to say.
So I want to talk definitions here. Define for yours truly, although I read the book and I know it, but define for the audience really and our listeners, internalized anti-Jewishness. And if you can contextualize it in terms of, is it anti-Jewishness, internalized anti-Jewishness? Is it another name for being a self-hating Jew? If you can talk about that, because that was one of the big questions that I had.
So absolutely, it is a kind of updated idea with reference to a self-hating Jew. I reject that specific verbiage because I don't think it's representative of the reality. I also don't think it's representative of the origins of this. But essentially, it's kind of the same idea. The way I define internalized anti-Jewishness is left purposefully broad because it has a number of manifestations. I identified three main manifestations that I discuss in the second chapter, but it really is a broad phenomenon which affects a number of Jews. So when creating a definition, I wanted to create something which was broad enough to encapsulate the whole experience. So it's internalized anti-Jewishness occurs when Jews absorb non-Jewish perceptions of Jews, Judaism, and Jewishness and allow the non-Jewish world to define our narrative, which is, as you can tell from even just that definition, it's quite different from self-hate. There's so much more to it, and it's really putting the blame on the non-Jewish world. And what I'm writing about is simply when Jews absorb the same ideas that exist in the non-Jewish, anti-Jewish world. So it's so much more than self-hate, although that would be another name for this phenomenon for sure.
And it's different than self-criticism, as you point out in the book. And I want you to elaborate on that.
Yeah, it's not the same as self-criticism at all. Self-criticism is absolutely appropriate if it's done in a fair, kind of empathetic way. We can absolutely criticize different parts of the Jewish community, our own part of the Jewish community. Of course, we know we can criticize the state of Israel and Israeli government policy, but this is something deeper. This isn't just a disagreement with a certain action. It's utilizing non-Jewish ideas to define Jewish identity and to define Jewish people as well.
And then talk about the three manifestations.
So the three main manifestations that I identified, as I mentioned with regards to the definition, are very broad. It kind of runs a whole gamut of experiences, and they are diminishment, denial, and deployment. Diminishment is, I would say, probably the most common form of this, and perhaps it's the most insidious. And it's the idea that we want to make our Jewishness smaller to be accepted. It doesn't mean we hate our Jewishness. It doesn't mean we're not proud to be Jewish, but when interacting with the wider world, we are willing to make it smaller. So we'll change our names, we'll change our faces, we won't stand up for ourselves. We'll say things like I used to say, I'm Jewish, but I'm Zionist, but, because what I was doing in that circumstance is showing the world that I was a good Jew, that I was palatable, that I wasn't so different. So I was denying kind of an element of Jewish particularity. Then we move on to denial, and that kind of does what it says in the 10. Historically, that would have been denying one's Jewishness and converting to another religion. Today, in a secular world, that's not necessary, but it's the denial of one's Jewishness and either converting to another religion still, or just simply saying, I'm not Jewish. Even if that person is halakhically Jewish, or even if not, they would deny the connection to Jewishness and Judaism that they do have, again, utilizing non-Jewish ideas to understand what it means to be Jewish. And then with regards to deployment, this is perhaps not the most dangerous, but it's maybe the most intense. It's when Jews deploy their Jewishness as a weapon to wound other Jews. And it's the kind of ultimate expression of wanting to be a good Jew. And I would say that anti-Zionist Jews often fulfill that criteria, because an anti-Zionist Jew is not someone who says, well, I don't support the existence of the Jewish state, but I respect the fact that you do. No, this is always an attempt to delegitimize our perspective as Zionist Jews and to destroy the world's only Jewish state. So it's never quiet. It's always rooted in anti-Jewish action. And I would define anti-Zionism as a non-Jewish idea. We know that there were anti-Zionist Jews pre-World War II, of course, but we're talking about anti-Zionism which emerged from the Soviet Union, which is the basis for anti-Zionist rhetoric today. And that's the rhetoric Jews have absorbed. And it's the most overt. As I said, I would probably say diminishment is the most dangerous because it affects us without many of us even knowing it.
And we had Dr. Rachel Fish on the program, and she invoked what you've talked about before, is that sometimes we're asked to leave our Jewishness at the door. And I want you to talk about that, because I don't think people realize really the extent of how much that's going on today.
Absolutely. I mean, the diminishment aspect of this, of the diminishment manifestation is enormous. It's enormously widespread. And it really is when the non-Jewish world, or the worlds in which we live, we have to remember as diasporic Jews that we're minorities. I understand that there are Jews in certain cities in America who don't necessarily feel like a minority, but that does not necessarily reflect reality. Jews, even in the United States, are a tiny minority. And the non-Jewish world has ideas of acceptable Jewish identity and unacceptable Jewish identity. So they say to us, well, you can be Jewish in specific ways. And that makes us choose. It forces us to choose between our Jewishness in its most authentic form and membership to wider societies. You know, if we look at it less from a national perspective and more from an ideological, let's think about the progressive world. Is it really possible for a Jew to spend huge amounts of time in the progressive world and be an active Zionist? I would say in many circumstances, it is not possible to be a Zionist Jew in those spaces any longer, because the progressive world forces us to choose. They say you can be Jewish, but you cannot be Zionist. So again, it's utilizing their perspective of palatable Jewishness, of what it means to be a good Jew. And we're always forced to check ourselves. And sometimes we're forced to check ourselves and we don't even realize. Again, I used to say, I'm Jewish, but I'm Zionist, but. And that was when I worked for a Jewish organization. My brother was in the IDF. My sister had also made Aliyah. And I was still qualifying my Zionism because I wanted the world to know, well, I'm a good Zionist. I believe in a two-state solution. And that kind of thing utilizes their ideas of our identity. And the only people who get to define Jewish identity are Jews. The only people who get to discuss aspects of Jewish identity in this way are Jewish people. The non-Jewish world should be listening. They should be asking clarifying questions, but they should certainly not be telling us who and what we are. And they should not be creating categories of good Jews and bad Jews. And as Rachel said, forcing us to choose.
So apropos of that, it's really all about acceptance, isn't it? And we
Mm.
had Gil Troy here on the program, one of the smartest people that I know, and he, together with Natan Sharansky, had written something in 2021, and you have that quote in the book. And if our dear listeners have the book, they can turn indeed to that quote. It's on page 125. I want you to read it, and I want you to respond to it, Ben, if you would.
Today's un-Jews remain as engaged with parts of their Jewish heritage as appalled by other parts, and as anxious for acceptance as their predecessors. And you know, when you said this is really all about fitting in and acceptance, that is exactly the crux of this. And we are in a very particular situation. On one hand, we're like many other minority groups, right, who are trying to integrate with the majority, but we're also trying to integrate into a world which is, particularly in the West, built through anti-Jewishness, anti-Judaism, as David Nierenberg describes. So there is something really challenging for us because it's not just, oh, we're a minority and we have to integrate, we have to conform, because of course we do. And that's not necessarily a bad thing. I believe that we should integrate into our respective societies. But the world, because of their own obsession with us, because of their own perspectives on us, which are so significant, it's not just some small thing which exists on the side. It is a major way that the West was created. They make us choose. They say, okay, you can be Jewish. And, you know, we have been told at certain times we can't be Jewish. So that was maybe in the Spanish or Portuguese Inquisitions when they forced us to convert, but they still persecuted us after conversion, or in the Holocaust where they said you cannot live. But a lot of the time the world says, it's particularly today, you can live and you can be Jewish, but only in the way that we deem appropriate. And that is a humiliation.
Digging back into the book, another quote, and this is you writing this time, and it's a rather bold statement. And I was quite shocked when I read it. You wrote, internalized anti-Jewishness is quite simply the single greatest internal threat facing the Jewish people, as it leads us to abandon, or at the very least weaken, our commitment to the continuation of Jewish life.
Absolutely. It absolutely is. You know, we are generations behind other communities. We have to have a very frank conversation as we are right now, but we need to have a conversation as a community. The LGBTQ+, the Black community, they have done so much more work on recognizing the impact of hatred on those communities. Internalized anti-Jewishness is one of the many ways in which Jew hatred impacts us. And it does. It forces us to diminish ourselves, to deny ourselves, or to turn against each other and to deploy our Jewishness as a weapon. There is simply no more, there isn't another internal threat. You know, we have strife, we have tension, particularly in Israel, but I believe that all over the world, the weakening of Jewish identity, the shedding of Jewish anchors is our singular biggest threat. Because if we're not passing this on to the next generation, what happens to it? It dies. We have to understand that Judaism and Jewishness does not belong to us. We are caretakers of it for future generations, and it's our job to rebuild it, to repair it, to mend it, to grow it, to evolve it, and we pass that on. And if we're not able to do that because we are wounded, then where are we left with? And I want to just reference that word I used, wounded. I hope that people who read this book understand I am not in any way blaming Jewish people for this phenomenon, for this experience. Even the idea of internalized anti-Jewishness is rooted in these ideas coming from the non-Jewish world. Jew hatred is a non-Jewish problem, and we, like many minority groups, in specific circumstances, can absorb that, right? It happens with the gay community with regards to homophobia, the Black community with regards to internalized anti-Black racism. We have our own version of it, and we have to wake up. We have to have important conversations with empathy, but we have to have the conversations.
I'm going to really challenge you on that notion of absorption and what people do with that information in just a sec. But I want to go with your line of thinking here for a moment, because one of the things that you talk about in the book is intergenerational trauma.
Mm.
And even though, for example, we did not live through the Holocaust, we still carry that with us.
Mm.
And I want you to address that because thank God my immediate family, my grandparents, great parents, all those that came over, they all came over way before the Shoah.
Mm.
Yet I have to tell you, Ben, you wrote something in the book, and I thought, oh my gosh, I thought I was the only person that felt this. I can't go to a train station
Mm.
or get on a train without thinking of the Holocaust.
Yeah, we are, I think, historically speaking, the most continuously persecuted minority group in the history of mankind. And I'm talking about continuous, right? The persecution of the Jews began thousands of years ago, and as we know, it's still continuing today. We were deprived of power for thousands of years. So we have had many experiences that are traumatic, whether it's the Farhud in 1940, 41 or 42, I believe, excuse me for not knowing that exact date, whether it's the expulsion of the Jews in the Middle East, North Africa, includes so the Arab states and Iran, the Spanish and Portuguese Inquisitions, the pogroms, the Holocaust, the massacres in the Black Plague. There are so many examples of this. And we have to understand that we are real people. We are real people with real ancestors who lived through these events. And enough studies have been done on trauma for us to know quite definitively that trauma is passed on through generations. There is work on talking about how genes are changed, and that's the study of epigenetic trauma. And that has been proven with regards to Holocaust survivors and also the descendants of those who survived the Rwandan genocide. But also we know from our own experience as Jews, the retelling of traumatic experiences over and over again is traumatizing. I don't remember the first time I heard about the Holocaust. It's always been a part of my knowledge and my identity to an extent. And I think that is the same for most other Jews that I speak to. And we have to just understand, I'm talking about a specific Jewish experience, but what I'm really talking about is a human experience. We're human beings. And this is the same pattern that happens in other communities. It's just, unfortunately, we have so many awful experiences that they live on within us. And we find ourselves having reactions to situations which are not normal. I'm not talking about you, Stephen. I'm talking about, I had that too, right? I wrote about it in the book. It's not normal for us to have those thoughts. It might be understandable, but we have to understand how the hatred that we experience impacts us. And again, we are generations behind other communities, and it's simply not good enough. We have to come together and have these important conversations. And talking about trauma isn't a sign of weakness, it's a sign of strength, that we're able to understand and process as much as possible our past and understand how that has shaped us today.
Well, sometimes I think I might have lived during that time and I've been born back again in the time that I'm being born in. I mean, there's that whole conversation of past life and past life regression, I think it's called. So anyway, so that's a topic for another conversation and perhaps another guest. But I do want to challenge you on this whole notion of absorbing all of the hate and then having that hate manifest in one, and then having it come out in that internalized anti-Jewishness or Jew hatred, if you will, however we want to define it. Because when I read that in the book, I thought, wow, I had never looked at it that way. Yet, the first person that I was reminded of was Eleanor Roosevelt and her quote that no one can make you feel inferior without your consent. And so at its root, I'm wondering, where does that come from? Because I had the most phenomenal parents. They're both gone now, but they taught me so many life lessons, and they taught me to be a proud Jew, and they taught me to stand up for what I believe, and they taught me that people will respect me more if I really draw the line on not conforming and whatever that conforming is. And so I'm wondering if you can address that.
I don't think that Eleanor Roosevelt is correct. I don't think it necessarily needs our consent, because this is often happening without us being aware of it. This is not something that we sign up to. It's something that happens in the world. And again, it happens to other communities. This is a widespread phenomenon, right? So actually, it's tricky to challenge it as a concept, because then we have to challenge it in the LGBTQ plus community. We have to challenge it in the Black community. And there is a huge amount of academic research, particularly in the Black community, on this. So with regards to, sorry, go on.
Yeah, I was going to say, yet, what about, there are people surely that have this internalized anti-Jewishness, to be sure, but what about the people that don't? Well, yeah, how widespread is it?
I think it's a pandemic. I think that every Jew has the capacity. Listen, it's not to
And
say
I
that
think
every.
there, and I think because I don't want to put people in boxes because I think there's always that danger. I think there certainly can be elements in many of us that
Yeah,
many of us at varying times will diminish our Jewishness. I
yes.
think
What
absolutely. But
what
but
I'm
and the
doing is
yeah, and the
talking about a human experience, right? So
mhm.
it's not that every single person will suffer from this. Again, I would say quite categorically that every Jew at the very least has the capacity. Whether they feel it, I can't say whether they feel it or not, but what I want to do was start a conversation about a human experience and a specific human experience in our community, because it does exist. So the interviews I did in the book are testament to the reality of this. Because the first half of the book, like my first book, Jewish Pride, is historical, it's theoretical, and then I switch into the emotional and I talk about individual people's experiences. And they are the lived experience of what I'm discussing. And this book came out in October of last year, and I've had the privilege of speaking about this issue to people all over the world. And I see people nodding and I see people thinking, you see the realization of, oh, this is an experience I have. And I think that what we have to do is look inside ourselves without shame, with humility, and with empathy. And it may be that there are individuals who say, no, I really don't think this applies to me. I'm not here to disagree with them. But it is an issue for our community as a whole, because even if some Jews experience it, then it should be a concern to the rest of us. But I would say again that I think a lot of Jews experience this. A lot of Jews I know in my life have been honest with me and said, yes, this is something I've experienced.
I think a lot of Jews experience it. Like I said, I wanted to challenge you on that because again, I think there are some that absolutely don't. And in terms
Sure,
of
but I
it's
don't say
in
that
terms of,
all do,
but
though.
yeah, not all of them do, but I think to some degree, I think a lot of Jews do, and I think to a large degree, a lot of Jews do. You said that earlier on in the conversation, you said that you don't want to blame the individuals for their internalized anti-Jewishness. Um, I do blame. You never want to say, "Oh, you're to blame" or "you're to blame" because but I will put responsibility upon the Jewish community, though,
Yes,
for a lack of education and for a lack of engagement for so
yes,
many people that
I agree.
that the Jewish community has done a very poor job
Yes,
in education and bringing out the joy and the beauty of Judaism rather than it's
yes.
just we're a people that's oppressed or you have something to be ashamed of. There, I will say a lot of responsibility falls on Jewish shoulders.
But communal Jewish organizations. And I totally agree with you. I'm very
Jewish
critical of.
organizations, but even within Jewish
Hold on,
families as well.
let me finish, please. Let me
Sure.
finish. Because the thing so firstly, I agree to an extent. Absolutely, there has been a failure in the Jewish community to educate. Anyone who argues against that, I don't think really understands the reality of the Jewish experience. I've had the fortune and the privilege of speaking to Jews all over the world, and people all over the world are saying, why didn't I know these basic facts about our identity? So there is a hole in our education. I want to be empathetic because, again, this is something that comes at us from the non-Jewish world. We are minorities. There is a power dynamic that exists between Jews and non-Jews in the diaspora. And again, one can feel like a member of the majority. It doesn't necessarily mean that's the case. And that person who feels like the member of the majority may not identify with this. Again, that's totally fine. But again, many Jews will. The reason I'm so empathetic is because this is not the fault of Jews. Even the organizations, and listen, I agree with you, they failed. And I think we have to start having really honest conversations about the organizations that failed in a way to make them better, not just to demonize. We're not here to
Yeah, that's why I
just.
said I don't want to blame. That's why I said I don't want to blame them.
It's really about understanding that the people in those organizations are individual Jews. The parents that you're talking about in Jewish families, they're individual Jews. What education did they have? What experience did they have? There is a cycle going on here. And yes, again, I agree with you. Absolutely, the Jewish communal structure failed. The Jewish organizations failed. But there's a bigger story. The Jewish communal structure, the Jewish organizations are made up of Jewish people who live as Jews in the non-Jewish world. And I think that you can both understand that this is a phenomenon that is coming from us, from the non-Jewish world, and also hold people responsible for their actions. I will hold anti-Zionist Jews responsible for the things that they say and do, even if I also understand that they have absorbed non-Jewish ideas from the non-Jewish world, right? It's things can exist at the same time. It's not one or the other. And I want to just, circle back just a tiny moment. I never say in the book, so for anyone listening, I never say in the book that every single Jew experiences this. I say it's a Jewish pandemic, which I believe, and I do say that every Jew has the capacity. And it may be that some don't, and that's wonderful, and I think probably quite rare, but that could still exist. But each of us has a responsibility to look inside ourselves to see if this does lie within us, and do it without shame. We have done nothing to be ashamed of. This is, again, the fault of the wider world who forces us to choose.
Yeah, I agree. I think two things can be true at the same time. And I do agree with you that I think it's a pandemic of epic proportions. I really do. I wholeheartedly, for a variety of reasons. But going back to the Jewish community, one of the things, as you point out in the book, are Jewish comedians that poke fun at Jews, and then that almost, and I understand humor is humor, etc. And look, my synagogue just had its annual dinner last week, and of course there was a Jewish comedian there, Elon Gold. He's hysterical, and of course he poked fun, and it's an internal, private event, and everyone got a good laugh, and we had a good time. Yet, it's almost as if when a Jewish comedian gets up there and makes Jewish jokes, it gives license to the non-Jewish community to say, here you go. We now can make jokes about you because your own made jokes about you. And I'm wondering if you can address that.
Absolutely. And I think that one of the ways we saw in the United States for Jews to be considered palatable is if the person was Jewish coded or kind of assimilated and would be funny. Funny Jews are one of the trichotomies of Jewish representation. And there's an interesting part of the book where I discuss the kind of development of the Jewish princess trope. And some of the people who were participating in this, or some of the key people participating in it, were Jewish men. And there was evidence that suggested, like evidence in newspaper articles that said when Jewish men would make these jokes about Jewish women, non-Jewish men would begin to make these jokes. And non-Jewish men would then perhaps commit violent acts against Jewish women. So absolutely, we do participate in our own oppression in that way. But I think what I'm trying to do is be as nuanced as possible. You don't want to make sweeping statements. We don't want to say, every single Jew has this, or etc., etc. You want to show that this is a very complicated subject because identity is deeply complex. But absolutely, there are many Jews who participate in the kind of degradation of the Jewish people. Elon Gold, I do not think does. I think that he is a fantastic, proud Jew, but not everyone who is making jokes about the Jewish people come at it from a position of pride. And I think that is really what this is about. We're allowed to laugh at ourselves. We're allowed to use humor as a coping mechanism, as we have always done. But we do have to be slightly thoughtful and slightly introspective about the tropes that we're employing, right? Are they tropes that exist in the non-Jewish world that are used to demonize Jews? Or are they kind of specific cultural references that only Jews will get that are kind of silly, but also profound and meaningful? Again, things can be both at the same time. But I do think when Jews are represented in the wider world, it is often the case that the representation is actually quite harmful, even if we're not necessarily aware of it. I write in the book about Friends. As a young Scottish Jew, I would love Friends. I loved when the Holiday Armadillo came on because Jews were never represented on British television. As someone in their 30s now who does this work for a living, Friends is quite harmful. And I want to say, that doesn't mean you can't watch Friends. You can watch Friends. I still watch Friends. It's fine. But we have to be thoughtful. We have to be considerate about what we're seeing and not just say, well, that was funny, therefore it's fine. No, maybe it's offensive and maybe it's not. But we kind of have to go through the process to work out which is which.
In the book, you talk about the golden age of America, but you say it wasn't a golden age, it was a gilded age. And I'm realizing I'm asking a Scot to provide his vantage point and his perspective on this. And can you talk about the difference there?
Absolutely. Listen, I obviously want to reference the fact, and listen, everyone can hear the fact I'm not American. And I always want to be respectful of the American Jewish community, and I will always say there's great beauty in it. But I do have a slight separateness, so it does allow me to be objective whilst engaging in this topic. It was not a golden age. It was never the New Jerusalem. It simply was not true. Jew hatred always existed in the American Jewish experience, and some of it was quite violent. There definitely was a period of American Jewish history when it seemed to recede. It being Jew hatred seemed to recede into the kind of more extreme parts of American society. But that does not mean that Jews were free from Jew hatred. Jews in the South were violently attacked. And there were Jewish historians that I quote in the book who referred to these violent attacks against Jews as blips. And to me, what that indicates is a desperate desire for America to be what it was meant to be, the last chance saloon, the place where Jews could finally overcome in the diaspora the plague that has followed us around the world. And it was never true. Now, at the same time, is it true that America probably was the place in the diaspora where Jews were able to integrate the most successfully? Absolutely. We're not saying it's all terrible, all doom and gloom, but we again have to be more nuanced. I don't believe there were ever golden ages in Jewish experience. I think there were times we were treated less badly and more badly. And there was someone I quote in the book who says that the erosion of Jewish culture, which took place in the American Jewish community, was a fair price to pay for the acceptance given to the American Jews. I find that to be an embarrassing statement. The bar should not be so low. We should be accepted. We should be respected, and we should be able to be Jewish in a way which we want to be, not following the lead of the wider world. So I think that I think it's happening. There is a reappraisal of the American Jewish experience happening. Again, not to say it was the worst of the worst and it was terrible and all the Jews have to leave America. Absolutely not. But what we're doing is applying nuance and saying maybe it wasn't so good. Maybe there were things going on that people were able to ignore. And we have to have those conversations. Maybe there was an erosion of Jewish culture in the United States because of the position that Jews were placed in. And that's not a judgment. Sorry, just say one more thing. That is not a judgment on American Jews. It's a judgment on the non-Jewish world, which was not able to overcome its hatred of Jews.
Listen, my family was like the third Jewish family. And I think the practicing Jewish family, the others weren't practicing, to move into the area where I grew up because the area used to be restricted from Jews. They wouldn't sell property and houses and everything else. And I have to tell you, and then we finally sold the house in 2018. So clearly my childhood and all adulthood, that was my home. Frankly, I never really felt comfortable there. I mean, I love the house, but the whole area, there was always a feeling of being an outsider. And we're talking about throughout my whole life.
Yeah, sorry to interrupt you there. And again, it's not to say it was awful. We're engaging in nuance.
No, it wasn't. It's a beautiful area and it was great. But, there was always that little feeling of.
Yes.
Yeah.
Because it is there, as Rachel Fisher said, as I've written about, we are forced to choose. And that existed in the United States. Even in the 60s and 70s, there was a forcing of Jews to choose. And that is not true acceptance. If you're forced to choose, it isn't true acceptance. True acceptance is where people say, come be part of our community, and we will benefit from you, and we will learn from you, and you will learn from us. It's an exchange. That isn't necessarily what happens. We are forced to be a certain specific way. And even though we could say, well, New York culture is so synonymous with Jewish culture, that's absolutely true. But it's in a sense a surface level of Jewish culture, right? And that's not to diminish, Yiddish culture that existed in New York or the theater, but it's to say this idea of the smoked salmon bagel, right, that people so strongly associate with New York City. Mm-hmm. We are so much more than that. We're an ancient, rich, beautiful, deep civilization, and every part of us should be respected and seen, not just the parts which speak to the greater American experience, i.e. the American dream.
Right. Well, listen, this would be a good time then for us to take a break. Ben M. Freeman. What does the M stand for again?
Maxwell.
Maxwell. I like that. That's one of my nephews is Maxwell. Okay. Listen, this would be a good time. Benjamin Maxwell Freeman.
Not Benjamin.
It's not Benjamin. It's just Ben?
Ben Maxwell Freeman, yeah.
Why aren't you Benjamin?
I think because my parents thought Benjamin Maxwell Freeman was a bit much.
All right. Yeah, I think I agree with them, but I like that. So listen, Ben Maxwell Freeman. Okay, I got it right this time.
Yeah.
I think this would be a good time to take a break indeed, and for me to share with our dear listeners around the world, and you, by the way, that Jewish National Fund USA's Global Conference for Israel is the place to be. In Denver, Colorado, the Mile High City is where it's going to take place from November 30th to December 3rd. Join leaders and innovators from around the world who are shaping the future of Israel. Plus, you won't want to miss, get this, Ben M. Freeman, America's largest Shabbat dinner. Do you like a good Shabbat dinner?
Who doesn't love a good Shabbat dinner? Come on.
Listen, then you got to come to Denver again between November 30th and December 3rd. Visit jnf.org/global. Once again, jnf.org/global to register and see all the incredible interactive Israel experiences, the outstanding speakers. There are really some great folks that are slated to address everybody. There's just this great ruach, this great spirit. There's wonderful networking opportunities, and they're all happening once again at that global conference for Israel. And if you are in earshot and you're listening to this program and you do like our podcast, IsraelCast, and who doesn't, by the way, Ben? Of course,
Everyone loves it.
of course, especially when Ben is on the show. This is your second visit.
Of
We're going to have
course.
lots more. I will be doing 2 live recordings of IsraelCast
Wow.
at the conference. I'm very excited about that in front of a live audience. And I always listen. I love doing actually, the Zoom thing. I even love it more when my guests are in studio, as I had Alex Rivchin on. And
Yeah.
he fortunately was in New York, and so we had him in the studio. But I especially love doing interviews in front of a live audience because the vibe is just there. And also, I
Yeah.
like to get audience questions as well because we have, I think, the smartest listeners in all of podcast land. So again, I'll be there doing 2 live sessions, and we hope to see everybody there. And I know that it's a long ways away from London, but maybe, Ben, you might find a way of making it to Denver. And we want you and everybody else in earshot to register at jnf.org/global. Hope to see you and everybody there. Have you been to Denver, by the way? I know you've been to a lot of places in the United States.
I've not been to Denver, no, but I spoke at the conference last year. It was in Boston, and it was an amazing. I cannot encourage people to sign up enough. It was an amazing experience to be with so many proud Jews, engaging in Jewish pride, engaging in important conversations about the Jewish people. It's a phenomenal experience.
It really is. I've been to a number of them, and I'm just like bowled over every time I walk away because it's the energy, the people, and oftentimes, you're seeing people up on a stage, or you get to meet them face to face or sit with them at a table during a break, and they're people that you know very well because you've heard them 10,000 times or you've read their writings. And it's just really just a phenomenal experience. And JNF spends like a ton of time putting these things together. So we want to encourage everyone indeed to go. Yeah, I missed last year. I was in Iraq of all places when that one took place. So that was an exciting thing for me, and that was a good excuse why I wasn't there. Anyway, let's get back to our conversation right now. And I'm really glad we are having this conversation because I do think it's a pandemic. I think it's a huge issue, this internalized anti-Jewishness, or a self-hating Jew, as I'm going to call it. Okay, however we want to call it. It's this person that really has some issues, and there are varying degrees that people have it in them. And I think that's the point that you're making in the book. And I think we collectively, okay, the Jewish community can do a better job, and families can do a better job, and synagogues and Hebrew schools and day schools to stop this from spreading, really. And so I want to ask you, and let's go there now, how do we really begin to nip this in the bud? And let's first talk about, you reference Seth Rogen in the book, and I want you to share that point that you talked about, because I'm going to kind of ask a question with a story. You can tell I'm Jewish here, right? Because don't just ask a simple question. Let's just sort of go off on 12,000 tangents, as I like to do anyway. But there's somebody that, and it's not only that I want you to reference Seth Rogen, but it's also addressing the story that I'm going to share with you right now, Ben. And I wasn't actually sure that I was going to share it, but I thought it's apropos to our conversation. There's somebody that I have to collaborate with on certain things, and I had brought up the word Zionism, and this individual said, I have an issue with that word. And I was not, the timing wasn't right for me to have a conversation with him on that, not only because of a time constraint, but also what we were working on at that moment. So there were a number of factors that I could not have a conversation on. This happened probably about a year ago. Now, this is someone that has been to Israel many times, that has an engagement with Israel, is Jewish, I think is very culturally Jewish, but I don't think, he's going to Shavuot services, or, he's not there on Shmini Atzeret or anything. I mean, but he's Jewish, I want to say a little bit, probably more than a lox and bagel Jew, but somewhere in that zone. So my question is, how do I approach someone like that? Or I have a very dear friend who comes from a German Jewish background, And let's face it, the reform movement started in Germany is a way of watering down Judaism. And I know people are going to write me letters and saying that, but that's just a fact.
I
Uh,
agree.
I mean, that's a whole other conversation. If we have time, we can certainly get to that. But, sometimes I think there's a sense of people saying, well, I'm going to do what's easy for me rather than what's halachically correct. And, there's halacha, which is Jewish law. And I kind of feel like I don't follow halacha to the letter of the law. There are people that are more observant than me. There are people that are less observant than me. But if it's halacha, I say to myself, if I'm not following it, that's halacha and I'm not following it, but I'm not trying to like water down the religion, which drives me absolutely crazy when people try and do that. Anyway, again, sorry to go off on a tangent, but my question is, how do you approach people like, for example, a dear old friend of mine who comes from a German Jewish background, identifies as being Jewish, but has been in a synagogue maybe 3 times in his life, isn't even a lox and bagel Jew, but will identify himself as Jewish. And this person that says he has a problem with Zionism, do I approach them and say, well, you know what? I'm suspecting you have a case called internalized anti-Jewishness, and here's Ben's book. Or where do you go with people like that?
I think for sure give them copies of my book. Who's going to say no to that? I'm an author. I want to sell the books. Education. Well, I actually want to reference what you said. Listen.
And by the way, how do you like that for a long-winded question?
I know exactly. Yes. Reform Judaism did start that way, and I'm a Reform Jew. I went to RSY Netzer, the Reform Youth Movement in the UK, and there's many beautiful things about Reform Judaism. And Reform Judaism does need to have a discussion about the origins of itself and how to overcome those ideas. Because,
yes. And let me just interrupt for a moment, because when we because I want to clarify something that I also said, because there are Reform Jews that are very Jewish engaged and very Israel engaged. Yeah. However, I have found there are people that say, oh, I'm Reform, but what they mean is I'm not practicing.
Yeah, and actually, RSY Netzer, the youth movement I went to, it was practicing. We prayed,
Thank you, because there's a big distinction there.
Yeah, it's not the case. And listen, I went to RSY Netzer, which is in the UK, and British Jews and American Jews are slightly different with this regard. No, I'm a Reform Jew, and there's many things in the Reform Judaism that I love. And I will also say, halakha has always evolved, and we are living in one interpretation of it. But that doesn't kind of erase the explanation for this development, right? It was not that, at least in my understanding, that Reform Jews wanted to evolve Judaism naturally and to kind of take bits from the non-Jewish world, which really they thought made sense, and they wanted to retain aspects of themselves. From my understanding, what the original Reform Jews from Germany wanted to do was remake Judaism in a way which made it palatable. And to me, there's a major difference there. But again, I'm a Reform Jew, and I really love aspects of Reform Judaism, and nothing's above critique. Orthodox Judaism is not above critique. We're allowed to critique ourselves and each other as long as we do it respectfully. You asked that at the beginning, right?
Yeah, but I just want to clarify. I was not dissing Reform Jewry, by the way. I was stating a historical fact, and I think it's beautiful that you are a Reform Jew and you are an engaged Jew. I guess that's the point that I'm making. Yeah. Yeah,
it's not. It should not be used as a way to indicate a lack of engagement.
Also, I will say one of my favorite expressions from the Lubavitcher Rebbe is labels are for clothes. So I never like to label someone as a reformer or this. A Jew is a Jew is a Jew. Okay, but I'm just saying the Reform movement.
Yes.
Yeah, go ahead.
Can I go?
You know what? I'm the host, so let me think about that. Okay, go.
Okay, thank you. With regards to your question, it's a fantastic question and a really important question about how we deal with this in our community. What I would do in that situation is not label someone. It's not to say you clearly are manifesting this. What I would do is start a conversation, and I would say to them, what do you understand Zionism to be? Because that's really, words have definitions. So what definition do they understand relates to the word Zionism? And then they may give you an accurate one, and then the conversation may go in a different way. I suspect particularly the first friend is going to, or that first person is going to say, well, it's maybe colonialism or imperialism or neo-Nazism or white supremacy or whatever. And then I would explain, listen, I understand why you would think that, but those are all ideas which came directly from the Soviet Union and the Arab states. Let me explain how this worked. The Soviet Union, along with the Arab states, created anti-Zionism, post-Holocaust anti-Zionism, which is what we're seeing all over the world today, right? They're part of the same story. And then we look at the things that the Soviets said, all of those things. We look at the reasons they said it. Why were they not just targeting Jews? Why do they have to go after Israel as a modern nation state? And then what you're doing is kind of giving them a different perspective, because it may be that these people don't actually know the correct definition of Zionism, right? I would probably guess they don't actually. And I would engage in a conversation which educates them. And a reminder to everyone, I am an educator. I'm a trained teacher, a lecturer. When you educate, you do so without judgment. I never stood in front of my class and thought, and said to them, you don't know this? How embarrassing. No. You offer information, you offer ways of thinking, and you do so without shame, without judgment. Allow the other person to grow. It might be shocking to you that a Jewish person doesn't know I'm doing inverted commas here, the correct definition of Zionism, but it's also the case. And if we want people to grow and to evolve, then we have to give them an opportunity to do so. And yes, for sure, give them my books, because my books, that's great for me, but also they are helpful. They break things down in a very accessible way. And I think, this is one of the first books on internalized anti-Jewishness in a century. There have been articles and other things written, but in terms of actual books published, this is a very underexplored topic. So they may not have any idea of this, but you have the conversation first. Well, what do you mean by Zionism? Because I don't understand how you could have a problem with the word Zionism if you understand it the way I do, which is the movement of self-determination to return the Jews to their indigenous land, the land of Israel. We have to have boundaries. Boundaries are really important. We have to say the only people who get to define Jewish experience and identity are Jews. The only people whose definitions we utilize to understand Jews and Jewishness are Jews. It's the Jewish definition, right? We don't need to look to the non-Jewish world to find out what Zionism is. We know what Zionism is, and we know it is rooted in thousands of years of Jewish experience and identity. And it's our job to tell that to the world and to each other, but doing so without judgment. Education is done without judgment.
And what about those that really don't care? And that's where I think your point about it being a pandemic and the greatest challenge to the Jewish people is so key.
So when I talk about Jewish pride, when I think about Jewish pride now, listen, I've been talking about this for many years, so I'm constantly kind of refining the idea and evolving it. What I'm doing now is talking about the head, the heart, and the hands. The head is the knowledge, right? The knowledge that we are an indigenous people, that even Jews in the diaspora, you and me, Stephen, are a member or members of a Middle Eastern diasporic community, that our people originated in the land of Israel and we are rooted there, right? That's knowledge. We need to feel the power of that connection. We need to not just understand it in our heads, but feel it in our hearts. For example, I was in Israel last week with the World Jewish Congress, having an amazing time at a really interesting and important conference. And I hadn't been to Israel in 7 years because I was living in Hong Kong, as you referenced, and COVID and whatever else. I cried when I touched down. And I can't really explain it because there's many factors which led to that emotion. But I felt like I was coming home. It's not enough for us just to know. We have to help people understand the feeling. How I do that is by helping them see the kind of profound beauty that exists in you and me having this conversation in 2023. You're a Jew who lives in New York City. I'm a Jew who now lives in London. And we're talking and we're coming together and we're challenging each other. And we're doing what Jews have done for thousands of years in 2023. This conversation itself is a miracle. And it's about helping Jews understand it. And that really is an emotional thing. And then the last part, the hands, that's the doing. I am a secular Jew. I wear a kippah, I wear a Magen David, and I started in the last 6 or so months to keep kosher. I don't eat pork anymore and I don't eat shellfish. Because we are an ancient civilization. We are tangible. It's not just an idea. It's not just a feeling. We are connected to real action. And every Jew has to find their action. So I believe, or I see the Jewish people or Jewishness as a civilization as a huge buffet table. And every Jew at this enormous simcha we're all at has to get up off our seats and go choose a combination of dishes from this table. You might choose hummus. I might choose gefilte fish. And it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter that you're choosing something different to me, but we have to choose. And I think that what I want to do is show all Jews that they are a part of our people, that they are part of the responsibility of making sure this continues, and they have a right to participate in this if they want to. And I want to encourage Jews to do Jewish. I mean, that was a wonderful book that was written, Be Jewish actively. And that's why it's the head, the heart, and the hands. But the most important part of that, I really think, is the feeling. But you can't have the feeling without the other two. But we need it. We need to feel. We need to feel the profound beauty that exists in the Jewish people, and the fact that we're still here today, and the fact that we are still carrying out practices that originated in our indigenous land 4,000 years ago. It is mind-blowing.
I agree. And, I was talking about the largest Shabbat dinner at the JNF conference. And of course, I jokingly said, hey, do you like a Shabbat dinner? Because everybody does. However, to be very serious about Shabbat dinners, I think that anyone that wants to make an impact on someone that's Jewish, that is not affiliated and that has no sense of Yiddishkeit, invite them for a Shabbat dinner, or invite them for Rosh Hashanah for a dinner or a meal or something, or a Pesach Seder, but probably start with a Shabbat dinner and show the beauty of Shabbat. And as I've mentioned before here on the show, and how other people have said, it's not that the Jews have kept Shabbat, but Shabbat has kept the Jews. And I think just showing that beauty, it's a really, really nice starting point that people can understand a little bit more about what Judaism is all about.
I was in Utrecht in Holland at the weekend, and I was staying with my partner's very good friend, who is halachically Jewish, but who is not raised in a very Jewish environment, so does not have a knowledge of Jewish practice or Jewish identity or Jewish experience, really. And I said to him, we had many conversations over the course of the weekend about what it means to be Jewish and my work, of course. And I said to him, I was like, listen, he went on Birthright. I was like, you went on this trip called Birthright. Jewishness is your birthright. And you have a choice to make, and you can pick it up and engage with it, and again, in a way which fits you and your perspective in your life, or you don't do it. But that comes at a cost, right? You then don't get to engage in the beauty and magnificence that we all get to engage in. And sometimes people say things like, well, you should engage with it because they're going to hate you anyway. No, that is negative. We're not basing our love of Jewishness on the hatred we experience from the non-Jewish world. What we're doing is understanding that this is part of us, whether we choose to engage with it or not. So we may as well choose. We may as well choose to be part of something bigger than us, part of something truly extraordinary. I love being Jewish. And the reason I wanted to write this book is because I wanted to help people go through the journey I had already taken with my Jewishness and with regards to my sexual orientation. I want us to be whole, to be authentically proud Jews, not Jewish but. And as we've discussed kind of at length, this is a problem in our community. We haven't educated ourselves. We have stopped talking about necessarily, or not necessarily stopped talking, I'll take that back. We have utilized the non-Jewish perspective. We're not a faith. We're a civilization that has a religion, that has a God. Faith is a Christian idea. We're meant to argue with God. We're meant to argue with each other, but we're meant to argue. We're meant to challenge. That is what we're meant to do. That is quite different from Christianity. We should understand ourselves through our eyes, our perspectives. We do not need to go outside ourselves, particularly because the ideas of Jews, which exist outside of us, are often rooted in hatred, not just misunderstanding. So that is why, again, integration is particularly hard for Jews. We can integrate, but we've got to integrate with pride. I'll say one more thing, because I know I'm speaking a lot here. Just last month, it was the King's coronation. And as a British person, I loved it. I watched it all, and I went to a club to watch the coronation, to watch some of it. And the club that I went to shared on Instagram a picture of me and some of my friends watching it. And you can see the King and the Queen in the background, and you can see my tartan kippah on my head. And I was there as a proud Jew. I wasn't checking my Jewishness. I didn't take my kippah off because I was kind of in a fancy place. No, I'm going to go in proudly. And now everyone looking at that picture can say, oh, there was a Jewish person there watching the king get coronated. I don't know if that's what you say. But that we're not choosing. We're able to have our dual identities. We're able to exist in a multitude of perspectives and identities, and we will not choose. We are proud Jews, and we also have many other identities, but we're not checking our Jewishness at the door.
And let's be reminded that the chief rabbi attended the coronation, and the king made concessions for him to say it. I believe it was St. James's Palace, so that he
Clarence
could.
House, yeah.
It wasn't Clarence House, because Clarence House is where the king lives. I think it was St. James's Palace,
Okay.
where he and his wife, the Rebbitzin, were able to walk to the
Yes,
abbey. And he
absolutely.
made that concession as a proud
Yes.
Jew.
Absolutely. And then at the end of the coronation, before the king got into the gold coach, there was a blessing from other religious leaders because Britain, as we know, is a Christian country. There isn't a separation of church and state. But that was a really beautiful acknowledgement that other identities, other communities exist in this country. And the king wanted to mark that. So seeing the chief rabbi bless the king was really an extraordinary moment because, as we know historically, coronations have seen the massacre of Jews, and the Jewish person, the rabbi, the delegation, they were allowed to participate as proud Jews. The chief rabbi was not forced to break Shabbat. As you said, he was allowed to practice his Jewish identity, express his Jewishness in a way which fit him. And the king was able to kind of work around it, which is the way it should be. We should be respected.
Ben, are we ever going to get to a point where we don't put people in boxes? I mean, because I think human beings are so complex
Yeah,
that everyone likes to, as I said, one of my favorite quotes from the Rebbe is labels are for clothes. Maybe it's just a human thing that we like to label people because
I
maybe
think so.
that's just our way of figuring out the world. But honestly, I'm just so tired. At least I can speak from the American context. I don't know about in the UK, or you just came from Hong Kong, but I'm just so tired of people labeling everybody as I'm a this, I'm a that, I'm a this, I'm a that. I just feel like we should just say you're a person, and each one of us has many facets.
Absolutely. No, I think that we will always label people. And people sometimes say to me, oh, we should get rid of religion because it's the source of all the problems. That's just not true. We are tribal. We divide ourselves into tribes, and religion has been one of the major ways we've done it, but we would find other ways to do it. But to be Jewish, to be proudly Jewish, to be loudly Jewish, isn't to label ourselves in a negative way. We, as I said, we should integrate. We should be able to express the multitude of identities that we have, but the important point is we're not choosing. And I really encourage everyone, of course I'm going to say this, but I do really encourage everyone to pick this book up and understand the message I'm talking about, because I really, obviously I think this because I wrote the book, but it is deeply important. Pride heals people, but we have to do the work. And you can think you're a proud Jew, as I did, and still be saying things like, I'm Jewish, but I'm Zionist, but. So we need to go on a journey as a collective, support one another, and engage in this topic without shame, without judgment, and with empathy. We understand it came from the wider world, and because we are a minority in that world, we have absorbed it. We've done nothing wrong.
Ben, I'm not just saying this because you're at the other end of the screen here on Zoom, but I'm really, really glad that you wrote the book because
Thank
I
you.
think it raised so many questions. And when I was reading it, one of the joys of my doing this program is that when I do get an author or someone's written a book, I get to ask them all the questions that I want to ask them after I've
Yeah,
read the book, because there's always 10,000 questions in my mind that always come up when I read these things. But you raise so many questions that it caused me to question myself and to look at other people as well, not to judge other people, but just to look at the way that other people act, react, and the things that they say and do. And so for that, I really have to thank you for writing this book, because it is so chock full also of not only thoughts and ideas and a way of looking at ourselves, and as a way of looking at us as a community, as a Jewish community, but also there are so many historical references in this book that I think are rather eye-opening for so many people, or at least I think they will be for many. So I really have to thank you for writing this book. I really do. And I just can't wait for no pressure here, but what's your next book?
so I'm working on it right now, and it should be out, all being well. I need to kind of get
That
off my.
wasn't a tease. That wasn't a tease for our listeners or anything. I had no idea
No.
if you were writing a book.
Yeah, no, I am. I'm writing a third because once I decided to write number two, I thought, okay, this is going to be a trilogy. The third book is going to be about Jewish indigeneity, because there are so many things that we do, so many practices that are indigenous practices. And the reason to think of indigeneity, the reason this is important is because we have indigenous rights. Zionism is an indigenous rights movement. We should understand ourselves. Now, of course, indigeneity It's an idea that comes from the non-Jewish world, and I always say that Jews should define ourselves. But there's no harm in utilizing modern ideas, modern methods to understand identity if they fit us. And indigeneity really, really fits the Jewish people. And the way I'm looking at it is the second book is called Reclaiming Our Story. The third book, the book about Jews and as an indigenous people, that is the story. It's where we come from. It's how we have survived as a people. You said it yourself. Shabbat has maintained us. And that is really, Shabbat is an indigenous act. So that'll be the culmination of the trilogy. And I hope it's going to be really thought-provoking and eye-opening. And like all of the books, it's to start a conversation and to help us consider our identities. What does it mean to be a Jew, particularly living in the non-Jewish world, but also a Jew living in Israel? What does it mean to be Jewish? How can we understand ourselves? What is our story? And the story that we need to tell is our story.
You know, one of the reasons why I love speaking with you is because you're such an ideas guy. And I think in this day and age, everyone just wants everything instant. You know, we got to look at the Instagram thing, we got to like it, we got to post, we got to this, that, and the other. And I don't think people stop enough and just think of ideas and think of concepts and think of our place in the world and indeed the Jewish people's place in the world. And that's why I'm just so grateful, truly, for all the work that you do. And I am truly grateful that you were able to join us, Ben Maxwell Freeman, on this episode of IsraelCast. Promise to come back when your next book comes out.
Of course, I would love to. I also love these conversations because often when I do events or when I have these kind of conversations, it's people are really asking for me just to recount the book. But actually, we have a real conversation and there's something really special about it. It's okay that people challenge me. I'm presenting a thesis, I'm presenting an idea. It's okay that someone says, well, what about this? What about that? That is what we're meant to do. We're meant to discuss, we're meant to argue. It's beautiful.
Right. That's the nature of who we are. Part of our DNA. Speaking of, listen, Ben, this has been so fantastic. We want to thank you so much for joining us. And once again, the book is called Reclaiming Our Story, The Pursuit of Jewish Pride. We wish you lots of luck with this and everything else in your life, and look forward to seeing you in London town before too long.
Thank you so much. Thank you for having me.
All right, and we'll have info about Ben on the show notes page of this episode on our website, jnf.org/IsraelCast. And of course, we do release new episodes of IsraelCast every other Wednesday. Mark your calendars. And just so you never miss an episode, subscribe to us wherever you get your podcast. It's so easy. Simply search for IsraelCast. I told you that was easy. And don't forget to rate and review us because that really helps with our rankings, which in turn make it easier for more folks around the world to find us and to hear from remarkable people like Ben. Or you can always enjoy the show by visiting us at our website. Once again, after all these years, hope you got it. It's jnf.org/IsraelCast. Now, it takes a homo shop to put IsraelCast together. For that, we thank Vivian Grossman, Dara Shapiro, JD Krebs, and Ellie Cadrin. Our editors are Jay Rothman and James Casada from Miratone Studios, right here in the very heart of New York City. And the music that you hear at the top until the program is titled My Eden. It's by the very talented Rafi Malkiel from his album Water on the Tzadik label. IsraelCast is powered by Jewish National Fund USA, your voice in Israel. For more info about JNF USA, do visit jnf.org. And don't forget to sign up for Jewish National Fund USA's conference, our annual conference in Denver, November 30th to December 3rd. The link is up there at jnf.org as well. And if you'd like to write to us with story ideas or just to say hello, Ben and I would love to hear from you. So email us at israelcast@jnf.org. Meantime, I'm Steven Shalowitz, thanking you for tuning in and looking forward to having you join us on future episodes of IsraelCast.